All right, everybody take out a hand and a finger. And if you didn't bring yours today, ask your neighbor if they can loan you one. We're not doing that one. Right, and turn to the person next to you and point at them.
Wait 1 minute.
And sort of note that there's, even if it's somebody you know and love, there's a lot of energy around somebody pointing at you.
Yeah, that's
okay. All right.
This one.
All right, now what you want to do is just point in front of you, not at anyone in particular. And then very slowly turn that around. Pay particular attention to the point of your finger and notice what might arise for you. It's kind of interesting. Where do you locate your consciousness? Is it in your head? So is your finger pointing at you in your head? But you're also your finger, aren't you? And those of us who are a little better at moving our consciousness around where we sort of centralize it and localize it can be in the hand as well. But what can happen, and what's interesting, is you can get caught in a loop, and this sort of can point out to you at a deep level the problems with subject and object, and thinking of yourself as an object. Because who's pointing at who? And if you sit with it gently, there's this kind of infinite regress that can go on in this circular motion. And it just sort of, you can try it many times and different things will come up that can kind of bring you to presence and make you think about how mind, in thinking in terms of subject and object, can be a problem, lead us astray from knowing who we really are. So I'm Scott Johnson. I'm a clinical social worker. I'm also a PhD candidate here at ITP. And I'm in the middle of my dissertation process. And this is the working title right now. I'm beginning recruitment. I'm just coming out of ethics. It's a working title. It may change, but it's a phenomenological exploration of the experience of will and willing in one's life. And that may change. But quickly, let me tell you what the agenda is for the next 25 minutes. I'm going to talk about why we should study will, why phenomenology is a great methodology for doing this. I'm going to talk about how this research could be a clinical intervention and how therapy can also be research. I'm going to advocate for a very particular type of phenomenological methodology that's not as popular here in the States. Talk about the pilot study briefly. And if there's time, I'm going to talk about Heidegger's conception of will and his idea of Gelassenheit, which roughly translates in English into releasement. So, will is kind of it's a slippery thing to get your hands on. There are certain things that have been studied by phenomenology that are a little easier to get. I'm thinking of, I think it was Fisher, a number of decades ago, did a study of anxiety phenomenologically. And the thing is, if I asked you guys what anxiety was and you were subjects and we were investigating it together, probably all of you could immediately come up with something around anxiety. Just immediately, because we all know the experience. It's the experience of standing up here in front of the room doing a PowerPoint. But if I asked you what willing was and what the experience of willing was, it'd be a lot harder to come up with something immediately. And chances are, a lot of you would immediately come up with a very cerebral, intellectual idea of what it was to will something, and less likely to come up with some sort of somatic, embodied, sort of whole body experience of willing. So there's a lot of questions that were, through the pilot study, I found a very delicate way of working with people to get beyond just the cerebral, intellectual level down to a more somatic, felt sense, and really focusing on experience instead of theories of what willing means. And I think I'll return to that later. But the first question is the most encompassing. What's your experience of willing things to be or have in your world? So, legitimate question, why should we care? And all the major popular treatment modalities, the behavioralists, the CBT people, the psychodynamic people, the existential phenomenological people, the humanists, everybody is struggling with the idea of how to increase the efficacy and outcomes of their treatments. And they're all identifying a lot of things that I think can be said to sort of constellate around will. Oops. And when you look at the literature, you see all these different words. Will, willingness, agency, motivation, self-efficacy, autonomy, capacity, volition, empowerment, locus of power, intentionality. And I think they're all dealing with elements of will. They're all trying to get a handle on how people own their therapy and own their change and how they sort of move themselves through the world and initiate change. So it's very important in therapy. You would think that it's the most important thing. People are worried about retention and treatment. I said that they want, these are all just various things people say in the literature about agreeing on a need to work on these various items that circulate or are around the idea of will. A lot of people aren't motivated. Clients are sabotaging or terminating their treatment. The economics of the situation now are causing us to create these short-term treatments that are ridiculously short. And so the idea of motivating people and having their will, if there is such a thing, engaged immediately becomes important. Again, these words, they're all about moving and changing. So what I find curious is that the question of whether we have will or free will is probably the oldest philosophical question ever posed. And a lot of philosophers have grappled with it, and more recently a lot of psychologists have written theories and developed theories and ideas of what is will using all these different conceptual ideas. But nobody has really actually studied will in other people. And I did a literature review, and one of my committee members, before he decided to come on to my committee for the dissertation, said, I didn't know if I wanted to say yes till I did a lit review, and I spent a month, and I'm just surprised to see nobody has ever done a study of will, ever, in other people, which is quite astounding. So they may have done studies again around these conceptual pieces, but nobody's done anything about, from a phenomenological point of view, on the idea of will. So briefly, phenomenology is not about theory building. It's not about postulating that the psyche is composed of all these separate, discrete objects that are moved around and interact through mysterious forces. It says we're not about theory building. We're about the experience. And we're not about causality. Can't get into this deeply, but from a phenomenological point of view, the natural science attitude that there is causality in the world in a linear time frame, that objects act upon each other and there's causation, is not a proven point. It's something that natural science takes as a given, but it's never been proven. Phenomenology says, we don't even look at that and we don't assume that. And I sort of said the last point, which it's not about creating a thingness or objects out of experiences and postulating that there are things like, going back to those terms, like there's motivation. You see a lot of literature where people are saying, what causes people to be more motivated, and let's measure the motivation in these different groups of people, as if motivation was an actual thing that we could quantify and measure. And it isn't, and in a way these terms that were up here before are just a way to sort of reify what we don't know and pretend that we have an idea of efficacy and motivation. We sort of label it and we say, isn't that nice? Now we know what it is. We put a word on it. So this study is not about doing any of those things again. It's about the experience. I've just said all of that. It's not about thingness. It's about detailed descriptions. And this is where I'd like to introduce the idea that this could be a valuable intervention for clients. That instead of focusing all the time as we do on goal setting and treatment plans, we don't really spend enough time working with people finding out how they actually think they move in the world. And if they think they can move in the world. Some people do deal with it, and I don't want to say that there are no therapists and there are no modalities that focus on that. In fact, the existential phenomenological therapists give a lot of focus to that. But this is where I'm saying that this can not only be pure research, but it can be an intervention to help our clients discover, before they start thinking about the content of what they want to change, discovering how they think they actually move and will themselves in the world. So that just sums what I just said, I believe. This makes an additional point that we're very goal-oriented, we're rushing past the investigation of how you move. Here I'm just briefly stating, if you look at state agency directed treatment plans, which I did a lot of my work in state agencies, or manualized therapy or evidence-based, there's an awful lot about establishing goals and much less about helping the person discover how they move. And here's where I want to stress that it's not about how you cognitively think you will yourself in the world. It's not about thinking about having willpower. It's about how you somatically, intuitively, energetically, how you feel when you do move in the world and you accomplish something. What does that feel like? What are the outlines of that? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What's my experience of when I'm aligned in such a way that I move easily with flow through the world? And if we knew that, if we knew that experience intimately, couldn't we sort of find ways to get ourselves back to that easier? Or couldn't we at least identify it as it was, this experience was arising within us? I think there's something there, and it would be positive in therapy. This is more about goal setting, which is very culturally biased. The idea of setting goals. Not everybody conceives of a worldview where we're here to just set goals and accomplish them. A lot of people are more process-oriented. This fear and anxiety piece, this is just a little tiny piece that in my experience as a clinician, I've noted over and over again that they say, common saying is that nothing succeeds like success. That when you start doing really good work with the client and they start having some of that fear and anxiety arise. I did a lot of work with dual diagnosis, people getting off heroin and cocaine who had also a mental illness diagnosis. When you start helping them put their lives back together and the anxiety and the stress and the drama starts to leave, it brings in another fear, which is, oh my God, how am I going to move in the world? People have said things to me like, am I just going to sit on the couch and watch TV all the time? What's going to become of me? And I would argue in the West, we're sort of addicted to thinking that fear and anxiety are motivators and the only motivators we can have. And if we have, so many of us, developed that sense that fear and anxiety are what we need to move forward in the world, well, then we're usually working at odds with our therapist who's trying to bring peace and serenity and some order to our lives. So I think in the West we should look at that. So back up to square one in clinical work. Investigate with the person how they believe they do move in the world long before you go to the content and goals. So not only are we trying to figure out how somebody makes that first step of 1,000 miles, but there's so much failure in therapy and in our own lives when we say, I want to change this, and we keep failing again. What's going on there? And I think it's connected to not understanding for ourselves individually what will and how we move ourselves in the world. And going back to the reification, we could do a lot better than just throwing words at it like motivation, efficacy, agency. It's more of what I've said before. I'm so efficient, I'm repeating myself. So this is something I've stated already. Again, not the content, but the experience and the process of willing and moving yourself. Now here's where caveat comes in. I've been talking about goals as if they were separate from will, and myself, because I need to speak in language which is inherently dualistic, have been sort of separating them as if they're separate. The caveat is that it may be that when we help a person get through the layers of conditioning from society, their personality, through all these different layers of sedimentation, and get closer perhaps to an authentic sense of what they really want in the world, we may find that what's there is very intimately interwoven with the idea of moving yourself through the world, like flow or wu wei. So I don't want to separate them. What I'm talking about more at the top, when I began speaking about this, is the kind of goals that we usually think of we're supposed to have, the normative oughts and shoulds that we have, that we set for ourselves as goals. But they're probably intimately tied if you get down to the bottom of what you really want and desire. And we probably all had the experience that when there's something you really love to do in life, you don't find yourself procrastinating around it. And you don't find yourself having to sort of, force yourself to do these things. You don't conceptualize yourself as having to will yourself to do the things you desire and love. I'm going to come back to this in Heidegger in a minute. Quickly, I want to advocate for a more ontological hermeneutic methodology in the US, which is more popular in Europe. Here in the States, you see a lot more of Husserl and his transcendental phenomenology. Here at ITP, just about every dissertation I've looked at using phenomenology cites Georgi, and they're all using that method. That's not to argue that it's a bad method, but I'm more interested in the Heidegger line. Phenomenology sort of splits into two major camps. One is Husserl, one is Heidegger. I'm more interested in Heidegger, and this gentleman who also worked at Duquesne, where people like Georgi was, he just died last year. But Paul Colazzi advocated for a hermeneutic, ontological, phenomenological method, and I'm using his work that flowed out of his dissertation to guide me in certain ways, which I'll mention. Again, he was influenced more by Heidegger. These are going to be the broadest strokes, because phenomenology is so complex, and I'm hoping I won't do Husserl any injustice. But generally speaking, he believed more in looking for essences, and applied to psychology, this would be looking for essential essences in the psyche. Heidegger was much more postmodern, and he was more doubtful about the idea of finding absolute essences. Now, to not do an injustice to Husserl, there are thousands of pages written about what he meant by essences, and he hadn't stopped working on this when he died. And he was arguing that he wasn't talking about essences in the sense of a very Cartesian, materialistic, reductive model. But it was taking him a long time, and he didn't complete convincing people on that. At any rate, that's a major difference. Husserl is confident in the idea of bracketing, and for anybody who doesn't know much about phenomenology, bracketing is the idea of setting your biases aside. It's the idea that you can locate and identify what your biases are around the object that you're studying or the phenomena that you're studying, and set those aside and keep them aside while you do the analysis. Heidegger said, I really doubt that's possible completely. He also said, probably more importantly, that your biases, what you're calling negatively biases, are actually the material that you use to construct your worldview. So from his point of view, there are no biases to take away. There is only your own worldview that you need to be transparent about. So I come down in that camp. So for the study, this means I will be more transparent about the context. It also means Paul Colazzi does something really interesting, which he advocated something called the individual phenomenological reflection, which he felt that the researcher himself should perform a phenomenological reduction and study on himself, just like the subjects, you do on the subjects. And then you publish it all, and then the end user, the consumer of the research, has the final task of seeing where everybody is situated and evaluating the research. That's a lot different than a lot of the studies that are out there, where you often don't know where the researcher is situated. So you don't know if they have biases, if you believe in such things. You don't know where at least they're situated and how they influence the results. Yeah, this is just the point. I like Heidegger more. He seems more postmodern. I'm really concerned that in so much, and this isn't Husserl per se, but in so much of other people's interpretations of Husserl, boy, it's hard not to feel like the same old materialistic Cartesian stuff is coming through the back door, and there's just a conventional reduction of people and psyche down to elemental pieces. Let me see what else. Oh, this is the idea. If we take this into clinical work, what you also see in a lot of phenomenological studies is the end product. After the phenomenological reduction is done, you get to see what the researcher believed was going on through his reduction. And all the material in between, from the top where the subjects were speaking in interviews to the final reduction, is not published and left out. If you're going to do this as a clinical intervention, I think all that material is really important, because none of us walk around the world operating purely from our essential essences, and that's what we see in each other. We're all operating, I am who I am through and through the conditioning, through all the layers of personality and so forth. So I think really, even as researchers, we should start valuing all the material that comes out of a phenomenological study. Of course, there won't be a journal anywhere that'll publish anything I'll write, because that'll be a monstrous document. But it's unfortunate we throw so much away. So I did a pilot study. I didn't do a full analysis and reduction on it, but what I did find is that, as I said at the top, it's not easily accessible. It's easy to be intellectual about it, but very quickly, if you just gently help people to sort of move beyond just the intellectual and the reified concepts that people pick up and adopt as a stopping place, you can help people get very quickly a lot deeper into some very visceral somatic places to really sort of start understanding the whole body experience of will. And that's what I'm saying there, that it wasn't as hard, but it took some gentle guiding and a few more questions and a little more directive than some phenomenological studies would have to be, say, if you were studying anxiety. The second point is interesting. I mean, there's people like Heidegger and Sartre and Metternich-Boss. There's a lot of people who pointed out the reason that it's hard to see will and talk about it is it's probably so fundamental ontologically to who we are that we can't see it. Right? The analogy is like a fish knows nothing of water because they're in it all the time. That doesn't mean you can't get to it and to some insights about it and some connection, right? And again, as a therapeutic intervention, it's less important to turn it into words that you can say about will than it is to help somebody sort of develop an intimate connection with whatever it is, the experience of moving themselves in the world. Quickly, how am I doing on time? Okay. Quickly, Heidegger talked about Gelassenheit, which is releasement. What's interesting is Heidegger saw the nature of being and man in a historical sense, and believed we were in a stage right now which was the end of metaphysics, the end of Platonic and Cartesian thought. He also pointed out we were deeply immersed in technology and enthralled by it. But the next step would come in a releasement from not only willing, but not willing, because not willing is in the same domain as will, which he felt were within the domain of ego. And to not will is to still be connected to will. But he talked about it eventually developing to a place of non-willing, which is quite interesting. And here's a quote: beyond the distinction between activity and passivity, because it does not belong to the domain of will, And I'm not the first one to notice it. Other people have written about how his conception of will is very similar to Wu Wei, which is the Taoist way of doing by non-doing, or Zen no mind, or the Western idea of flow. This is getting near the end here, but this is a piece I'm passionate about, how we've objectified ourselves with technology. And this is where we're not talking about technology just in terms of computers and machines. We're talking about the social structures and organizations we have, where we have given organizations like corporations or schools, any kind of organization, sort of a ontological status, and we've started to treat them as if they're human. And then the people who work at those institutions are considered human resources, which is an objectification. The people, say if we were talking about a school, they'd be the students, they would be the consumers. The point is that we have gotten ourselves into a place where our institutions, we treat them as more important than the people they're supposed to serve. And it's a serious, serious problem. It's interesting, right? Didn't corporations just get the right to vote? Or not vote, but well, with money. They're considered an actual entity, so they can have these super PACs and give as much money as they want. Briefly, the existential phenomenological therapies are already in this area. They believe that freedom is our natural state ontologically. So a lot of the therapy there is about helping somebody get to their authentic self. And so there's a real synergy there. In fact, one of my committee members is an existential phenomenological therapist. So there's stuff out there, and there are people who have been focusing in ways. But the takeaway here would be, I think we need to look at this more, we need to study it more. I think one of my committee members said this could be revolutionary because this is really where we need to be with therapy, not the content, but how people move themselves. The other takeaway would be, if you're thinking about doing a study in phenomenology, consider something along the lines of Heidegger as opposed to Husserl. I'm not saying it's superior, but it's somewhat neglected here in the States, and certainly here at ITP it's not very well known. And I think that's it. Thank you. So, any questions? Yes.
I would just say I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm right with you in your critique of reductionism and your desire. I mean, I have resonances myself with overcoming the Georgi method. Yeah, and I would also say that your interpretation of Husserl is somewhat outdated in certain respects, and that there's a lot of scholars in the last 10 years that are writing big apologetics to Husserl because of this interpretation, and that Georgi's method is in some sense an abstraction or a distortion of Husserl's phenomenology, largely as a result of Heidegger's kind of alignment to some extent with the Nazi Party and suppression of Husserl's publications of his work. And yeah, so I'd just say there's a lot of material that's been published in the last, only really the last 5-10 years, kind of reframing the whole context phenomenologically. Yeah, there would be some good literature for you to look at, you know, and but your basic thread, I mean, that you're moving towards is really rich and really aligned, I would say, with Husserl's vision and Heidegger's vision in this dialogue. I would just, yeah, I'd be happy to point you to some of those references. 'Cause for me, it was a big shock because I, at one point, was in a similar place to yourself, because all the literature for like 60 years previous to the last 10 years is more in, a critique of Husserl as a reductionist or as an essentialist, or so. Just want to throw that out there to you, for your research.
Thank you. And I am aware that I was really being two-dimensional about the difference there, and I knew that I can't even
well,
open
that's
it
a
up without being
standard.
fair.
Yeah, that's a standard critique too. It's throughout a lot. You know, the majority of the literature too. So I could see where you're drawing on it, and I would just also offer you the perspectives.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, but perhaps it would be, I'm sort of aware that there's this going on, and perhaps I should just leave it out, because my point is less a critique of him and more sort of advocating for Heidegger and Paul Kalasy, who didn't get a lot of attention, but his work is phenomenal too. So thank you. Arthur.
I want to compliment you on a thoughtful presentation. And one of the, as faculty read dissertations all the time, and we read professional articles all the time. And what you said about people who are producing these not bracketing their beliefs is really something that I see all the time. A person might talk about, we bracketed our briefs in accordance with, this model, but they don't tell you how they go about doing that and what those beliefs were.
Right.
I mean, it's
right.
just like,
Right.
what? Well, what have you done? Nothing.
The standard stamp.
Is it? Yeah.
You know, I bracketed.
Yep, so.
Thank you,
It's
yeah.
really terrible.
Thank you for, yeah, that was my experience, and that probably also informs a bias against Husserl, that like
Yeah.
people pick up Georgie's work, which is an interpretation of Husserl, and I see it, and it's like, oh my God, we're just giving ourselves license very quickly to be in the same old boat. Thank you. Anyone else? 2 minutes, last chance. All right, thanks everyone.